Welcome to the Self and Society podcast, exploring what it means to flourish as an individual and a community. This is your host, Ari Armstrong. Music by Jordan Smith, cjsclassical.com. Join my email list or help support the show financially at ariarmstrong.com. Our guest today is Lawrence Goldstone, author of Out of the Flames, the remarkable story of a fearless scholar, a fatal heresy, and one of the rarest books in the world. Thanks a lot for being with us today, Lawrence.
Thank you for having me.
So this book came out in 2002, so it's not your newest book, but to me, this is exactly the kind of period in history that I've been researching lately, so it's right up my alley. And this is such a timeless story. People have been interested in Servetus for hundreds of years, and hopefully they'll continue to be interested in him for hundreds of years. So I appreciate you taking the time to return to what for you is sort of back in your catalog.
Well, it really is. It is such a fascinating story, and how we came to it is a story in itself. So it's always fun to talk about this book. Nancy and I wrote 6 books together, and I've written a bunch on my own, and she has. But this is one of our favorites for lots of reasons, because of the material, because of some of the language we got to use. But how we came to the book, how we came to do the book, was a unique story in itself.
Well, in Michael Servetus's life just interacted with some of the most important and pivotal moments in European history, at least in the last, millennium, and some of the greatest figures of the 1500s, and then later, after his death, people in the 1600s and up to today. So it's also just a great introduction into that era of history and some of the important elements of religious tolerance and such. So.
It's got so many levels. One of the things that has happened, which was very gratifying, is in a number of high schools across the country, they use this as summer reading in AP history. And so we're constantly getting emails from either parents or kids, because it touches science, it touches religion. It is the story of the first information revolution, which has stunning parallels to what's going on now. So it is a story that was far more timeless than we realized it was going to be when we did it.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, because I was just blown away by the book. Just so you know, by the way, the reason that I got turned on to your book is because I was reading a book by an English historian named John Coffey, and he has a book called Persecution and Toleration in Protestant England, 1558 to 1689, so it overlaps some of your history. But in that book, he tells very briefly the story of Servetus. He's focused on England, so he only mentions it. But I got so interested in this character, I figured I should do some more research, and then I happened upon your book. So,
it is, people find some of the best books I've ever found were because of mentions in other books. There was a book by a man named Andrew Dixon White, who became president of Cornell, called the something like The Conflict of Science and Theology in Christendom, or something, which traced every empirical science from when it was purely theologic through the dawn of empiricism, and then on to where the science is kind of where it is today, at least for most people. And we discovered somebody named Roger Bacon, who was an amazing character in the 13th century, and wrote about him. So it is these links. People who like history like links, like finding something that leads to something else. And so when you write history or read history, this is the sort of stuff that happens, which is the most fun.
Well, and that's what unfortunately, it took me too long to come to appreciate how much a study of the past illuminates our present life. And so I would just urge readers out there who might think this is anything but dry and alien from our lives. It is very much, you can see it all around us, even today today there are people who are killed for their beliefs in certain parts of the world.
Oh, there is, in addition to the material being so topical, could not be more topical, when good historians, and for narrative historians like Barbara Tuchman is kind of God, there is, you read it and it reads like fiction, and we get a lot of comments. Most of them are positive, but some negative comments, and said, this wasn't a very good novel because X or Y, and you have to say, well, Actually, that's because it isn't a novel, but it's a compliment because the style and going through the book made them feel like it's a novel. Let me just tell you the story of the first information revolution that led to Servetus or Servetus. I've never figured out how to Servetus.
Wait,
I've heard them all, but
can I back up? I
sure.
totally want to get into that, but let's just stop for readers because I think a lot of people haven't heard of this character. So give me your elevator summary of who is Michael Servetus, just to kind of set the context, and then we'll get into the information revolution that you're talking about.
He was a rare genius. He was a brilliant theologian. He was he discovered he is considered the father of comparative geography. He discovered blood circulation, 75 years before William Harvey, and got no credit for it. He was a doctor. He was one of the people who pioneered autopsy. He had all of these. He had the distinction of being condemned to be burned at the stake by both Catholics and Protestants. And the Protestants, John Calvin, finally succeeded in doing it. He was only 42 years old when he was executed, and he lived the most extraordinary life. He escaped. He escaped in a way after he had been arrested. He was a doctor under an assumed name in Vienne, which is near Lyon in France, and escaped in the kind of way that you would see in a Bourne movie. So he led this amazing life. He was a brilliant man, but he had what was described as a genius for indiscretion. He simply was unable not to say what was on his mind. And ultimately, he made enemies everywhere, and it cost him. He didn't even have to die after this hair's breadth escape. He could have gone to Italy where supporters were waiting to shield him, but he went to Geneva to confront John Calvin, who was kind of his bête noire. And there was a show trial, and these two, and they went head to head. And that's another thing you would see. It was the kind of trial that you would see in a John Grisham movie. So there is this guy's life was unbelievable.
Well, I tweeted the other day if Netflix or Hulu or Amazon is looking for another miniseries, they should definitely buy the rights to your book and have you help with the screenplay because it is just the account of him escaping from prison was just remarkable. And I thought, man, if you were writing a screenplay, you couldn't come up with stuff this good from scratch.
Your lips to Hollywood's ears. We've had any number of our books optioned, and none of them ever. One of the things you learn when you deal with Hollywood is everything. All these incarnations of Hollywood where you think it's not the real world are gross understatements. Hollywood is not the real world. I'm not sure it's the real universe. The way they do things, the way they think, the way they talk, how they spend money, what they spend money on, it's mind blowing. So I would love it if they did it, but after you're in this business for a while, you say, okay, whatever happens.
Well, Jeff Bezos, if you're listening, I'm sure he's a regular listener of my podcast. Put your thumb on the scales and get this one made.
Really?
So here's some key dates I wrote down just to kind of put things in context for listeners. The Gutenberg Bible came out in 1455.
Right.
Which will become important for reasons that you've hinted at.
Yes. Now we're into the information revolution. That's correct.
Right. Michael Servetus was born in 1509.
Or 1511, depending on...
Oh, okay. Maybe I looked at the
It's
wrong...
one of the two. Both dates have been used. I think we used 1511, but it doesn't really matter.
I was also just referring to internet sources, so who knows?
Internet sources.
Well, you don't have a thing in the back with the timeline, so I was.
No, we didn't do that. We don't do that. You got to plow your way through it.
Okay, so Luther's 95 Theses were posted in 1517.
That's correct.
So just a few years after he was born, and this is profoundly important. So he lived right in the thick of it in terms of Reformation history. He published his first book when he was relatively young, called in English it's called Errors of the Trinity.
Right.
in 1531, which is how he first got sentenced to death by the Spanish
Yeah,
Inquisition.
that's right.
He then, as you say, he lived under an assumed name and studied medicine and such. It wasn't until 1553 that he came out with Christianismi Restitutio, or
Yes,
the restoration of Christianity, I guess
that
we'd
is
translate
right.
it.
That's correct.
And the same year that this book came out, and this of course caused a big storm. For one thing, he talks about the Trinity, which was it got a lot of people in trouble. And the same
Well, he
year
did
he
that in the
was,
first book too.
what's that? Say that?
He did that in the first book too, Errors of the Trinity. He essentially
Oh.
denied the Trinity. He said it was not in the original because he could read the original text because he was, oh, I forgot to mention, he also was a brilliant linguist. He could read Arabic, he could read Hebrew, so he could read the original text, and he said the Trinity is made up, which in fact it was. Later in after the Council of Nicaea, and so he was writing Errors in the Trinity, which was a direct attack of Saint Augustine, who had written on the Trinity.
So for purposes of his life, him writing his 1553 book while he was living under an assumed name is what linked him to the older book, which is what part of what led to his death. So
Right.
he was not only discussing these themes again, but he was doing it after he had safely made a break from his old life. And so
Yes. Yes. He didn't. Discretion, as I said before, discretion was not this man's long suit. Which is, my wife said, that's why I'm so drawn to him.
I have to say, and so he was burned in the stake the same year,
Yes.
1553, in Geneva, when
Yes.
Calvin was basically the dictator of Geneva.
Yes.
But going back to that point, obviously I'm irritated with Calvin through this process. I think he did a horrible injustice. But reading through your story, I could not help but to be angry with Servetus, because I'm just banging myself on the forehead saying, why would you do that? And
Yes.
so, if I understand the history correctly, when he was supposed to be escaping, he actually went to Geneva,
Yes. That's correct.
got a hotel room or the equivalent in
Yeah.
Geneva, and actually went to a church service where
Yes.
Calvin was in attendance. Is that true?
Yes. No.
My
I don't.
God.
I don't think he went to the. He might have gone to the service where Calvin. He did announce himself there, but it was clear he was there. He is the kind of guy you want to shake by the lapels. He didn't have lapels probably, but you want to shake him by the lapels and say, "Don't do this." But he just couldn't help himself.
And this was long after Calvin had made very clear that he wanted to see Servetus executed.
Oh, their rivalry went back to the University of Paris in 1534 when Calvin was still Jean Chauvin, which is the name he was born with, and they were competing students. And Calvin was very frustrated because this foreign student, and Servetus was going under Michel Villeneuve at that point, was besting him, and they were supposed to have a debate, but Servetus was warned that he was going to be arrested, so he left and he didn't show up. Jean Chauvin later became Jean Calvin, and he had loathed Servetus for 20 years, and Servetus just baited him. In fact, Calvin Institutes of the Christian Religion, Calvin's magnum opus. Servetus got a copy and effectively put notes in the margin and sent it back to him. Like an editor saying, you don't know what essentially, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And Servetus was such a brilliant theologian that the notes were stunningly accurate, and Calvin, who was dictator of Geneva, was thinking, if I ever get my hand on this guy, I'm going to have him burned at the stake. And he did.
I think it's fair to say that Calvin was fairly impressed with himself.
Well, yeah, but I think you could say that about Servetus too. I mean, in fairness, it was one of the things, because it was a new world, and we should go back and talk about the information revolution, because the personalities that it created were very similar to, you can see John Calvin and Mark Zuckerberg. Let me just do this. What happened was Gutenberg in the 1450s invents printing with movable type. He didn't invent printing. Okay. But lots of people were doing it because people who had survived the plague the year before, there was a lot of interest. People were learning to read, and there was a big market for being able to create books that you could do more than one copy, not just woodcuts or scribes. So Gutenberg creates this process, beating a couple of other people who were very close to it, and they print, I think, a couple of hundred copies of the Bible. This is called a folio. There's a piece of printing paper about 18 inches by 36 or something. If it's folded once, it's called a folio, which are these giant books you see in museums. If they fold it twice, it's called a quarto, and they fold it 3 times, which is like a hardcover today, that's an octavo. So Gutenberg does his folios, and they all of a sudden they have revolutionized information, because hundreds of copies can be made of any one book. And then eventually, but it's still mostly in monasteries, folios are big, it's not for the common people. Then quartos start to be developed in, say, the 1480s. And then a guy named Aldus Manutius comes along. He is an Italian, and he does 2 things. He folds the paper 3 times, creating the octavo. So think of the folio and the quarto as mainframe computers, and then the quarto as kind of an office computer. But Aldus folds the paper 3 times, creates the size of a hardcover that can be fit in saddlebags, develops a new kind of font called italics, which slants, which you can get more words on the page, starts printing 1,000 copies of every book. They fit in saddlebags, they go across Europe. Think of that as the beginning of the internet. At the beginning, Aldus is just reprinting the Greeks and the Romans, classical authors. But then in the early 1500s, people start realizing, hey, if you can take in information, like I remember I used to use Prodigy to just take in information. You can put it out. And people like Desiderius Erasmus start writing new stuff. And it gets printed 1,000 copies at a time, spreads across Europe. And all of a sudden, think of these people as bloggers. Erasmus was your ancestor. And all of a sudden, people are not only learning classical knowledge and knowledge about plants and medicine, early medicine, but they're getting their ideas out there. This had never, ever happened before. And in 1517, Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses. A century before, a man named Jan Hus did roughly the same thing and was burned at the stake, and nobody knew it. But something happened with Luther's 95 Theses before he went before Charles V and said, "Here I stand." And that was someone printed them. A printer took those 95 Theses, created 2,500, I think it was, and they went all over Europe. And that was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. So by the time Luther gets called in front of the Emperor Charles V, he is so well known that he has become invulnerable. So all of this process leads into people like Servetus writing on the errors of the Trinity at the end of the 1520s, where everyone starts to read it. People get followers. So you get these people whose fame and whose prestige and whose wealth and position is all based on this new technology. And if you don't think that's Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg, you don't know anything. I mean, these people are precisely in temperament, in style, and in practice what we see today from these internet giants, from the Google people. And so a Servetus is kind of a rebel and going against the established order. Calvin was a nobody. And by the time Servetus confronts him in 1553, Calvin has ridden the fame, this internet fame, to be the dictator of Geneva. and they clashed. Servetus lost and was burned at the stake. I mean, this is an amazing story that if you read it, you think you're reading about today. So
And
I'm sorry for taking all that time, but I mean, that's really the crux of what's going on here.
no, no, that's excellent. And for listeners, just the material from you and Nancy about Gutenberg's struggles. He was a genius technically, but not so good on the business end. And the subsequent rise of this printing revolution, that by itself is worth the cost of the book. That's just super interesting.
Yeah, he got the Fust and Schaefer, Johann Fust. He had his invention stolen from him, and he died in obscurity. We don't even know the year Gutenberg died. We don't know where he's buried because he was totally, everything he did was just stolen out from under him.
And I found it a little bit humorous that Servetus's first book, Heirs of the Trinity, was a runaway bestseller for its
Right.
time. Whereas Calvin's first book, which I don't even remember, it was some kind of
Institutes.
literary novel.
Yeah, right. Yes, it was a flop.
Yeah, it did very poorly. But his later work, which was I would
Institutes. Yeah,
summarize, yeah, Institutes of
the Christian
Christianity,
religion. Yeah.
it was extremely successful and went through many, many editions. And well, that's why we know the name Calvin today because he
Yes.
wrote. And so, to me, I think you do a great job of weaving together these three important strands of history: the printing revolution, as you've mentioned, the rise of humanist ideas, which began to be printed in these new books. Which, incidentally, the small books were also easier to hide from the censors.
That's right.
They had that going for them. And then, as you alluded to, the rise of the Reformation, starting with Luther, and then Calvin and many other figures. And these three things interacted together in this really interesting way to forge that era of history in that part of the world.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm thrilled. You know, you write these things because I suppose you can tell this book's reasonably old, and I'm still totally psyched about it. You write these things for the enjoyment of other people. You know, it's being a writer. It's in many ways, it's really a dreadful business, but writing is wonderful, and sharing is in this kind of sharing is wonderful. And so when we hear that someone has enjoyed what we did, there's just nothing better.
Well, I think it does a great job of striking the balance between the deep academic work, but then writing it in this vibrant way that's accessible to everyone. It's like you said. I often thought it's like, wow, this could have easily been a novel instead. So yeah, I think it's
Thank you.
yeah.
That's the trick. You know, academics are funny because a lot of them they decry the ignorance of the ordinary person and then write books that only another academic can decipher. You know, the trick to me, and there are people writing Eric Foner in American history, which is really what I do the most of. You just write really well. It's accessible. The scholarship is superb, but you go through it, and in the end, it's painless to read, and that's what we aspire to.
Yeah, I really just quick aside. Today I was looking at a history book that I actually want to read at some point, but it was $64 in the Kindle version, and I thought, what, do you people want anyone to read these books? So yeah, there's definitely this problem in academia, I think, of making work basically inaccessible to normal people, and so you're the opposite of that. So thank you
Oh,
for that.
thank you. We
So go ahead.
no, you go.
Okay, so I wanted to discuss Servetus's some of his key ideas, and we've already alluded to one of these. And so, to my mind, there's three. Actually, I'll add another one, which is tolerance. But he's considered an anti-Trinitarian, which we'll
Yes,
get into. He has some interesting ideas about child baptism, but that's not really the key point. The key point is his view on original sin, as in we don't have it, as opposed to Calvin. His view on predestination,
right.
and then what's really fascinating, especially for us today, is his views on religious tolerance. And so let's return back to his view of the Trinity. So maybe set up the traditional view and then try to explain where Servetus was differing from that view.
Well, what happened in the first 2 centuries of Christianity was Christians were having a lot of trouble getting converts because people couldn't seem to grasp this notion of God being in human form, but not in human form. They were having a lot of trouble explaining it. And I do believe it was St. Augustine who originally said, well, that's because these forms all merge, and there was no Trinity in the original text. But in the Vulgate edition written by St. Jerome, I think in the 4th century, this is not my strongest area, he developed this notion of the Trinity. And to Servetus, all of this, the thrust of what Servetus had to say was that God exists in everything. In fact, during the trial, one of the passages, and the trial was recorded, by the way, so we have more or less a transcript. Servetus said God is present in everything, and Calvin said, well, that means you mean God is present in the floor, and if we walk over the floor, we walk over God. And that was the crux of the argument. Calvin wanted to take the notion of God and remove it from people. And so you had predestination, you had all of this, you had God's will, godliness in its entirety imposed on people externally. And for Servetus, God was a more internal phenomenon. He's also, by the way, considered the spiritual founder of Unitarianism. You go into any Unitarian church and you mention Servetus and they will know who he is. So the thrust of all of this, so Servetus aimed at certain conventions that he thought were contrivances that allowed the Christian church, both Catholics and Protestants, to maintain control over the people. Because even though Protestantism supposedly took the priest as an intermediary to God, they didn't change anything really, because God was still this internal phenomenon. And to Servetus, making God an external phenomenon was a violation of what the tenets of religion should be. And so everything that he did was based on trying to change that central perception.
So let me try to summarize my idea of what Servetus was after, because frankly, when I would read what he had to say about the Trinity, it seems just like parsing very fine semantics to me in some ways. So it seems to me Servetus was saying something like, well, God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are not three separate persons, but they're three separate aspects or modes of God. Does that seem fair? A fair way to summarize this?
Yes. Yeah, because again, you're thinking three separate persons is making it that much more external. Three entities, three aspects of God, and then where do you put God? So yes, it is parsing in the sense that, I'm a constitutional law scholar basically by training, and so I read a lot of Supreme Court cases, and I see parsing constantly, and within the Constitution, I see lots of instances where a justice will write an opinion and force fit that opinion into his, sometimes her, predetermined predisposition and preconceptions of what the Constitution means. That's the same thing that's going on here. What you have is two overriding views of the nature of God, and then each of them trying to create what amounts to a legal argument to show that their conception is correct. So the parsing, yeah, but you would see the same thing in institutes of the Christian religion. Every phrase of the Bible means this means this. And in fact, the scholastic method, which when it goes back to Peter Abelard, is the basis of all of this, both theological analysis and current legal analysis.
Well, and of course, the debate over the nature of the Trinity that is a huge issue in Christianity, going all the way back to Arius. And so, there have been lots of people killed over
Yes.
slightly variant views of the Trinity.
Yeah, we had fun with Arius. He was after the Council of Nicaea, he was exiled to Albania, which I think we said was no more appealing then than it is now.
Mm. Well, he got off easy though,
Yes, he did.
relative to
Oh
just
yeah, yeah.
later
Could have been
people
worse.
following his footsteps.
Yeah.
And so, well, where the rubber hits the road, as far as I can tell, with the Trinitarianism, is your view on how close to human beings is God.
Right.
So, with Servetus's view, God is very close to human beings.
Yes.
But that's not very convenient if you want an established religion with your priestly go-betweens between human beings and
Yes.
God.
Yes.
So it very much feeds into the politics of the church, and then the church feeds into the politics of the state. And so it's an issue that is seemingly small and semantic, but it quickly becomes all engulfing in terms of
Absolutely.
the organization of society.
Absolutely. The closer you make God to man, to humans, then that it means you need the intermediary that much less, and therefore the intermediary has less power. This is power politics we have going on here. People did not want to give up the whole. Luther got started because he went to Rome and he saw what he thought was the total corruption of the church hierarchy in maintaining power and having these lavish banquets and living wonderfully while telling ordinary people to do these ridiculous things and then to indulgences and then to pay for them. So if you take the step back and you say that that maintaining power, personal power, was one of the motivations of the people who were dealing with the religion, then you see how Servetus's points of view were so threatening to that, because he's saying, well, you are responsible. And if you go to a Unitarian church, it's a very personal kind of form of worship. And because what he is saying is you are in fact responsible for your own goodness. That is not going to be, somebody else isn't, and it wasn't imposed on you, and it wasn't decided in advance. You make your own choices, and you decide what is good and what is not.
Okay, yeah, that's a great. It's again, that's one of those issues that's just so important for us to understand today, because I think, especially today, a lot of people in America, well, and throughout much of Europe, just think this is kind of silly. But if you look at how it was actually the role it played in the context of history, it's really interesting and important.
It could not be less silly, because if you, yes, maybe in this incarnation of centuries ago, but the nature of goodness, what constitutes goodness, what constitutes godliness, if that's the way you believe, is the central issue that we are dealing with politically in this country, in Europe, around the world. There is no stronger issue than what is goodness. I mean, regardless of what your political point of view is, we have a political philosophy now that is based on power and strength. And I think conservatives and liberals would agree. They might disagree on whether that's a good thing, but that is an incarnation of what constitutes goodness. So these issues, they have not gone away at all.
Well, that's a good transition to another point, which is the debate over original sin and child baptism. So maybe set that up for us.
This is not this is not my strong suit. I'm much better in doing this in a philosophical sense than a theological sense. But original sin and predestination, baptism is definitely not my area. But original sin and a predestination, again, is something that takes will. Anything, if it happened before you were born and you have no control over it, then you are helpless to change the course of events. So you are if you believe in original sin, and if you believe that man is essentially a sinful, and that sin resides in us and has never stopped, well, what's your choice? Calvin's notion was, you can live a perfectly good life and still go to hell if you were predestined to do so. But if you live a bad life, then it probably means you weren't. If you reduce Calvin's philosophy to its essence, it's hard. I could never understand why people would ascribe to it, because it doesn't give you any opportunity. It's like a life sentence without parole. It gives you no opportunity to control your own life and to change your own destiny. So this whole notion of original sin, and probably goes into infant baptism also, although I have to say, in fairness, I've kind of forgotten that one, is based in this notion of who controls destiny and fate, and who gets into heaven.
Right. Well, just a personal note, I was raised in a Protestant group where predestination was very remote to the way of thinking. So I've never been sympathetic to this Calvinistic idea of predestination. It's never made sense to me.
Right.
And now, I mean, I'm not religious anymore, but so anyway, I was very sympathetic with Servetus' attack on Calvin on that point. Another point which struck me. So during the trial in Geneva, Servetus was treated quite horribly.
Yeah.
As you described, his prison cell was dark, dank. He complained about being eaten alive by maggots,
Right.
which he was not. That was not hyperbole.
Nope.
Not having sufficient food, not having changes of clothes, not having basic tools by which he could do research and write defenses of himself. He was given pen and paper occasionally. And so it was just truly horrific conditions. And it seems obvious to me that they did this to people to try to beat him down psychologically so that they would just confess, or at least not put up a fight and recant their positions. I mean, that just seems obvious that it was torture for purposes of getting people to at least publicly state that they'd changed their minds.
Yes.
But what struck me...
We haven't come that far from that, by the way.
Well, unfortunately, yeah, we can talk about criminal justice a different day. But what struck me about this is how cogently Servetus stated his case, even in these horrific conditions. Honestly, I'm not sure I would last 2 days in those conditions before I'd just be such a mess. I'm not sure I could do anything. But he survived weeks of this kind of which I would call torture. Weeks. I don't know if it extended into months, but certainly weeks.
No, it was weeks. Yeah.
In these horrific conditions. And not only that, was able to create some outstanding defenses, not only of himself directly, but of general concepts that he believed in. And one of the things that struck me is his comments on religious tolerance, and saying, just making the broad point, look, you have no right to prosecute people based on their beliefs. And I just thought that was remarkable. And so, in a way, I consider him, I think it's appropriate to consider him one of the patron saints of religious tolerance.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. He is, I sometimes tell friends we're all victims of our strengths. He was a remarkable, remarkable man. And as we said earlier, none of this had to happen. But he just couldn't, he couldn't restrain himself from attacking. I believe, there's no direct record of this, but I believe he saw Calvin as the epitome of everything he was fighting against: intolerance, ignorance, self-aggrandizement, because Servetus was not, he could have had followers and chose not to. And that passion that he had for those ideals allowed him to endure these horrific conditions and maintain his brilliance, because brilliant he certainly was, and maintain his own energy, and to go into court and to create what was a stunningly effective defense. And if this wasn't a Stalin-esque show trial, he would have been acquitted. So yes, but it is these very strengths that put him in this position in the first place. It's almost Shakespearean. Here you have this incredible character with this tragic flaw.
Yeah, I was struck by, you can call it naivete or you can call it sort of a purity or an innocence, that he seriously seemed to think that the truth would win out and that the better argument would win the day. And what actually happened is that the more politically powerful
Yep.
won the day. Um,
I know.
and so
Again, something else with contemporary overtones.
it's inspiring and it's also maddening
Frustrating.
and kind of a warning.
Yes.
Kind of a warning.
Oh,
So
when you write this, when Nancy and I wrote this together, and there were times that she would sit, we would sit, and she would say, "We have to, we have to do justice. Are you sure we're not?" I said, "Look, we're doing our best, because he's somebody you want to defend so much because." His decence, forgetting about all the indiscretion, and he had a big ego and lots of character flaws, but he was decent in a way that was so fundamental that you just want to protect him. And we obviously couldn't protect him physically, but we tried very much to present him in a way that did justice to his passion, to his ideas, to his brilliance, and to his commitment to what we do now consider, yes, a much more tolerant society than the one he encountered.
well, that's what I continually thought reading your book, is that it does do justice to Servetus,
Thank you.
and I was really happy about that. I mean, it's a scholarly work of history, but it's also, I mean, the history is. I mean, look, it's just easy to sympathize with Servetus, and I think it does. Just the fact that we remember his name now more because of other people's biographies and your more recent biography, I think is an act of justice towards Servetus. So
Well, I hope
I
so.
think that part is excellent.
Because even if you don't believe in, even if his theologic point of view is not your own, and you should, one should value the man and the way he expressed his beliefs.
And even later, as you mentioned later in the book, even Calvinists who talked about this era of history later, at least granted that Calvin made a horrible mistake in this. And I doubt you could find any Calvinists today who would say, "Oh yeah, that was a really good idea to burn Servetus at the stake." And so, in a way, in that sense, Servetus's ideas have won the day, at least in Europe and America. And so, there's something, I don't know. It's
Well, they've won. They've won in a moral sense. I believe that we would now, if you put the morality of John Calvin and the morality of Michael Servetus next to each other, we would say, well, the morality of Servetus is a lot more appealing. On the other hand, behavior has not necessarily changed. So the hypocrisies that so infuriated Servetus, I think we're still fighting them, and sometimes successfully, sometimes less so.
Well, to me, that's one of the key things that we need to learn from history is just how horrifically individuals and normal individuals, not just these warlords, not just Genghis Khan,
Right.
normal individuals can behave toward other people, just slaughter in the right or slash wrong conditions. What we consider to be normal people very often descend to the most brutal sorts of behaviors, up to just torture and murder. And it's just astounding to me that this is possible. But it's something to obviously.
We are a flawed species. There is no question about it. We have been fighting people. One of the things, because we do history, and you go back and you can do people in the second century. The remarkable through line is that people are reacting much the same way today to similar stimuli than they did back then, and we're fighting the same battles, and we are striving to achieve the same goals. I mean, one of the great joys for me to write history is to delve back and to get to know people, because they're not all that different. And you get to live with people and really understand who they were and see the battles. And they're very much the same thing we're doing now.
And I guess the other side of that coin is we should try hard not to take for granted things like our American First Amendment, which was the product of a long battle for religious liberty and liberty of conscience. And so we have made, I guess that's the inspiring part of it, we have made, I think, real moral progress in certain respects. And it's something that we need to fight to preserve. So that's why these kinds of stories, another reason why I appreciate these kinds of stories.
I couldn't agree more. Originally, John Jay, who was not at the Constitutional Convention, he was a Huguenot or descended, and wanted Catholics forbidden from holding office in the United States. And there were a number of laws that barred in a number of states. There were places where Catholics or Jews could not teach school, could not hold office, and religious tolerance, the unwillingness to have a state religion, was something that was not taken for granted, but was something that was imposed, because despite what a lot of people say, very few of the founding fathers were devout. Washington wasn't, Jefferson wasn't, Adams was probably the most religious of all of them, and he wasn't particularly religious. But they had prejudices, and they refused to write those prejudices into the Constitution, which I think is a remarkable triumph.
Well, before we move past Servetus's life to his legacy, I will point out that his death, as you describe in the book, was horrific.
Horrible.
I mean, they burned him at the stake, and it was not quick.
They roasted him.
And so I don't know if
Yes.
I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
They used greenwood. They used greenwood. The leaves were still on. The fire burned slowly. They wanted it to last a really long time, and it did. It was truly horrible. Calvin did not go to the execution.
Yeah, it's amazing that people can participate in that kind of thing.
And of the 3 copies of the book, we haven't really talked about the book, which is now incredibly valuable. One is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, one's in the National Library in Austria, in Vienna, and the third one was discovered in Scotland. And the one they discovered in Scotland, in Edinburgh, turned out to be Calvin's own copy. And he had ordered all the copies of the book destroyed, but he could not bring himself to destroy his own copy.
So just for listeners' benefit, there's quite a lot of the book after the death of Servetus, which deals with, because one thing that happened is they tied one of Servetus's books, the Christianismi Restitutio, which was his longest work and much more in detail. They tied it to him, and Calvin explicitly, intentionally tried to wipe out every single copy of this book.
He did. They didn't actually tie it to him. That's one of the things we discovered when we went to the Bibliothèque Nationale, that the copy that was supposedly tied to his leg that was singed on the pages in the middle, not on the outside. So it was somebody had dripped while they were reading it. It was the prosecutor, Colladon, his copy, and because his notes were in the flyleaf, and he had obviously reading it by a candle dropped wax. So if there was a copy chained to his leg, it was totally destroyed. But Calvin did. There were 1,000 copies printed, and Calvin ordered all of them hunted down and destroyed. And they got 997 of them. And the only 3 that survive are Colladon and Calvin's, and then one other, which no one knows who owned it, although it ended up with the King of Transylvania. And now it is in the National Library of Austria.
And so your book becomes something of a mystery story, and people rediscovering these copies in sometimes very surprising circumstances. And that's really fun, because after this horrible depression of reading about Servetus dying, at least his life's work survived, and people can still read it today.
Yeah, the hunt for the 3 books, or the discovery of the 3 books. That was really fun to do, because we got to bring in Louis XIV and one of his mistresses, and we got to bring in Count Telecki, who was a Transylvanian count who discovered 2 large lakes in in Africa, and we were when we first did it, we emailed our editor and we said, "Oh, you're not going to believe this. This guy Count Telecky, who was kind of founded the Boy Scouts or something. I don't remember, but he's an amazing character." I said we described him. We said he was from Transylvania, and our editor wrote back and he said, "Well, perhaps he was a vampire," and so
That's funny because I mentioned the same thing to my wife. It's like
yeah,
we got to Transylvania, I was
yeah.
wondering if there were going to be vampires introduced into the
And
story. The rest of it is so
And
crazy.
Transylvania was the most tolerant place in Europe at that time, which is something else nobody knows. And in Cluj, which is, I guess, the capital, it still is. We've been to Vienna and we've been to Paris. We did not get to Cluj.
Mm.
There are still all these monuments, and Count Telecky was a very big deal. And then the one in Edinburgh was discovered in some library in the back shelves, and that we knew that was Calvin's copy because Calvin had torn the first 16 pages out of his copy to mail them to Servetus, or to try to get Servetus arrested, and that copy had the first 16 pages ripped out. So it's a great detective story.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, and I'm going to leave that mostly to listeners to discover for themselves. There are four characters that you mention in that latter part of your book that I do want to mention a little bit more because these are people known to us today for the most part. So there's people who came across Servetus's work were in some way inspired by Servetus. Leibniz, the philosopher and
Right.
mathematician, Voltaire,
Yes.
Thomas Jefferson, and the physician William Osler. And
Osler.
so let's go through them. And when we get to Osler, we can talk about Servetus's great scientific discovery, which I think we mentioned but haven't really discussed in
Right.
detail.
Well, Voltaire was an early supporter. In fact, we Voltaire's um, country home, was in Ferney, which is right across the border from Geneva, and he could look down. We went to visit, and he could look down, and he wrote this scathing critique. He loathed Voltaire loathed Calvin, and he wrote this scathing critique and defended Servetus and actually returned Servetus to fame. Leibniz and Jefferson was introduced to Servetus through William Small, who was his tutor, who was a member of the Lunar Society, which is which is a story in itself. Leibniz was also they were drawn to the scientific aspects of him, and William Osler was the probably the best known physician in both Canada and the United States, and then subsequently in England. He was one of the founders of the Johns Hopkins Hospital. He was knighted. He was Regius Professor at Oxford. And I did a historical thriller about autopsy and medicine at the end of the 19th century, in which Osler was a character, along with Thomas Eakins, the painter, and William Stewart Halstead, who is the founder of modern surgery. Servetus was one of these guys who was just kind of under the surface all the time, because the discovery was this: in Christianismi Restitutio, he discussed blood circulation because he had done autopsies when he was at the University of Paris. In fact, he was the surgeon in chief after Vesalius, who is considered the founder of modern anatomy. And he hypothesized about major circulation, which is the movement of blood through the heart and the lungs, because before, people thought the heart wall was perforated. They didn't know that it had two separate sides. And he even hypothesized about capillaries. And this is long before anyone else did. And when Osler, who was a book collector, came across Servetus's work and saw this, he became a major Servetus collector, which is how we found out about Servetus in the first place, because there was something called the Bibliotheca Osleriana, which is a catalog of all Osler's books. And he had an amazing library, and in it were all these things by Servetus. And we lived in Connecticut at the time, and we went to the library at Yale, the Medical Historical Library, where they have all sorts of amazing stuff. And we just uncovered all this really, really cool material.
And it's kind of humorous to me that this he just slipped in this passage on anatomy in this book on theology.
Yeah, it was just to make a theological point, and it turned out to be as significant as any anatomical discovery in history. And but because the books were destroyed, of the three books that were subsequently found, the first one was not discovered until the 1660s. And Harvey, of course, published in 1615 or somewhere around there. So Servetus's work had been lost. Harvey does major circulation, pulmonary circulation, becomes this huge international celebrity. To now we say, oh, William Harvey discovered blood circulation. No, he didn't. Servetus did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he deserves due credit for his independent discovery, but
Oh
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
Servetus
Well,
Servetus equally deserves credit for
yes.
discovering it
Well, that's
first.
like Leibniz and Isaac Newton were both working on calculus. Independently, they both discovered calculus at roughly the same time. And so we say, well, who discovered calculus? Well, both of them did. There's some question as to whether or not Newton had seen something of Leibniz's work, but that's probably they were just working into two brilliant guys, happen to be doing the same thing at the same time.
Well, I'm glad that that little tidbit of his Servetus's work has survived and become known, because that was, that's a clever thing to discover at that time.
Very.
So, so you mentioned his Unitarian legacy, and you have a lot about the history of how that developed. And I'll just mention one story which I found really nice. You talk about this heresy trial in the among Unitarians in America, but
Right.
it turned out quite a lot more friendly than did the issue with Servetus. So I just thought that was a nice illustration of sort of
Well,
the tenor of the
yes,
Unitarians.
it is definitely a difference in philosophy that essentially one trial ends in a burning at the stake, and the other one ends in a harumph.
So one thing I wrote down from Osler talking about Servetus, he said he remained faithful unto death to what he believed was the truth,
Yes,
and I thought that was
yes.
just a perfect summary. So, any rate, so that was excellent. If you don't mind now, I would like to move to stage two and talk a little bit about your other work and your process and things like that. Before we do that, is there anything else that you think it's essential to get in about Servetus before we?
No, I think we covered a lot. The book is covers a lot of territory, so
Yeah, I'll
you
point
can't
I'll
get in
point out for
everything.
listeners. Yeah, for listeners, we have scratched the surface of this very rich book, and so we've hit some of the highlights. But to really get into the details of the story, and it's just fascinating front to back. So please buy the book and get into it yourself, and go through what we discussed in more detail. And there's tons of stuff that we didn't have time to get to. So that's my pitch for it.
Good. I love
So,
those.
so as we were talking before we started, you and your wife have both written an extraordinary number of books. Honestly, I don't know how you have the time to do it. And so I think you started out writing books with your wife.
No, we started writing separately, but
Okay.
then we wrote six books together, and five of them we had a shared vision. And on
Hmm.
the sixth, the vision diverged. And as our daughter remembers it, um, I, I remember when mommy went after daddy with the fork.
There's this
And
funny line. There's a funny line on your website. Site. It says, "I have also written a number of books with my wife before we decided to save what was
what was
left of
left
the
of the
dishes."
dishes. Now, I'll tell you why we stopped writing together, since I'm the one who's on. We stopped writing together because that's on her website too, but it's my line.
Any rate, well, I'm glad that you were able to get this one done together. I'm just going to summarize some of your other titles. I believe your most recent one is Unpunished Murder.
Yes, that's a book on constitutional law. That's for high school, although it's a good starting point for adults who haven't read about constitutional law. It's about a massacre in 1873 in a town called Colfax, Louisiana, where 150 heavily armed white men slaughtered more than 100 black men. And the case ultimately went to the Supreme Court. They couldn't do it on state charges because it was Louisiana, and three men were convicted. They went to the Supreme Court, and in a case called U.S. v. Crookshank, which is a very important case. The three murderers were let go, but in addition, the court undermined a lot of the protections written for black people in the 14th Amendment, and it started a snowball effect, which ultimately resulted in the Jim Crow laws.
It seems, although you've done older history, it seems like you've focused on American history of, basically American history and legal rights, and that.
Yeah, I'm an American historian. Nancy is doing she does European history, mostly women who have held in positions of great power and did remarkable things and have kind of written out of history by the men. And so she's a lot of royalty. She's doing one now on Maria Theresa and three of her daughters, Marie Antoinette being one of them. I think I mentioned that. And I am mostly constitutional law, but I've also written 3 books on innovation. I wrote one on early aviation, early automobiles, and submarines, all of which took place in basically the same 10-year period.
And you have, how many novels do you have?
I think about 6. And
What's the title of the one that includes Osler? Just, I don't.
Anatomy of Deception. That is my
Anatomy of
best-selling
Deception.
book. Yes, yeah,
Okay.
that one did pretty well.
All right. I'll definitely check that one out. And so, yeah, my list of Nancy's books are, she's covered Mary Queen of Scots,
Right,
Catherine de' Medici,
right.
Joan of Arc, and Joanna I of Naples,
Yes,
which is someone I have no familiarity with.
and who is utterly fascinating. That one you should pick up because nobody knows her in the United States, and she was an amazing woman. Defended herself before the Pope, ruled in her own name, started hospitals, fought wars, raised armies, and no one's heard of her.
And another one that was interesting to me, one of the co-authored books, is called Deconstructing Penguins. And I have a 4-year-old, and so this book seems to be about
Get
how
it.
to how to read what it, summarize the
Get
theme
it
of
for
the
your
book.
4-year-old. We started when our daughter was in second grade. We were not altogether pleased with the way they were teaching reading. I mean, not how to read the words, but how they
Hmm.
were talking about books. Did
Hmm.
you find a personal relationship with a cat? Or so we decided to start parent-child book groups, and we did them, and we brought what I think are a lot of very sophisticated concepts, which we boiled down and used to get kids interested in why a book is the way, why you should be interested, what's really going on, what is the author talking about here, what are the characters, what do they mean, not whether you feel, whether they had a cat. And they did stunningly. We ran them, we were going to run them for 3 grades. We ended up doing it for 9 years. And the kids we had in our original ones, I mean, they're off doing all sorts of amazing things now. In addition to, by the way, all getting 750 plus on their English SATs. And that's as an incentive. But though that was a really interesting book to write, and it continues to sell. Just people just are discovering it, and we get emails all the time. What do you mean by this? I want to set up even if you don't want to set up a book group, it's how you should approach a book with your kid.
So just to clarify, you mean you set up groups and other parents would bring their children and then you would discuss a book?
Parents and children, and the
Okay.
discussions broke down not by age but by argument. You'll see it if you read the book. They were amazing. The sophisticated nature of the discussions by both, and often the kids were much more sophisticated about what's going on because they came without preconceptions. And then
Hmm.
sometimes you get an argument between one kid and somebody else's parent, which was pretty funny.
I love that idea. I mean, so my child will is set to go into kindergarten in a year, and so I have a fair amount of anxiety about what we're doing about school and education. So I'll definitely
Well,
pick that up.
it's whatever, 90% of it is what goes on in your house, and you're clearly, you're highly intellectually curious, and that's the kind of thing that comes that you will transmit to your child.
I sure hope so. Do you have anything? So as I said, I mean, you've just written so many books. I'm curious as to how you get it all done. Do you
I
want to
just
say anything about your
No,
process?
I don't do it like most. Nancy sits down and works for hours and hours at a time. I sit down, get up, walk around, go to the gym, get an idea, come home. Sometimes I come home and I've got an idea written on a very sweaty piece of tissue paper. It just everybody works differently. Thing is, every time I finish a book, I say, "Oh, I'm going to take some time off. It's really tiring," and then 2 weeks later, I'm back at it because I love it. It's really, really fun for me. And history, there's so much you can do. You can go online and read newspapers, not just the articles, but you can see the ads. When I did Anatomy of Deception, it was, a lot or another book, Deadly Cure, which was about the introduction of heroin into the United States as a cough medicine for children by the Bayer Company. That's true. And you see the ads for patent medicines, and it's wonderful stuff. So I just get to bounce around and live in these and right now I'm researching a book on the early NAACP, and they had a magazine called The Crisis, which was edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, which is wonderful. You just read it, look at the ads for if you want a position, this is where you get a good job. It's great stuff. It just so I don't really have an answer other than other people probably find me extremely boring, but I really love what I do.
Well, like I said, this is the only book of yours I've read so far, but it was wonderful. So,
Well, thank you.
and so have you? I noticed you put one. I think it was one of your novels out just online through yourself. Generally speaking,
Yes.
have you had good success with publishers, or do
No.
you have any horror
With that
stories?
one,
Or
no. Publishing. I have 1,000 publishing stories, almost none of them good, and none of them that I. All I can say is you go into this business because you believe and you love writing. You do not go into this business to be a bestseller or to be famous or anything like that. It is a terrible business for that. But writing itself is just a glorious thing to do. And the book that I put out on Kindle, I had written and I thought was, I thought it was pretty good. Nobody picked it up, and there it was. And it's kind of dated now. And so I just got after, I don't know, 20 years, I just got my first Goodreads review, and it's 1 star. Well, the book's kind of dated, but there's a lot of good stuff in it. It's about a company town that loses its company, which may be something that we will be dealing with in the not too distant future. But they're just, it's just fun to do it.
okay, so your website is lawrencegoldstone.com.
That's right.
Nancy's is nancygoldstone.com.
That's right.
Is there anywhere else that people need to be looking to find your work or your updates?
No, where, if websites work or Amazon or, this, we're around.
Well, I'll do show notes too, so I'll definitely drop the links into my show notes
Thank you.
for people to look at. And so I think we're going to wrap it up at that point. Thanks a lot for being with us today. I really appreciate
thank
it.
you. This was really fun. It was really fun to talk to you.
I loved your book, and I hope people go out and read it and buy it. I think it's a very important part of history that most people aren't aware of.
I will not disagree.
No, it's honestly, yeah, it's one of the favorite. It's one of my favorite history books that I've read. So,
well, thank you, truly.
Well, this has been the Self and Society podcast. For more, please see ariarmstrong.com.